Good afternoon and welcome to this web conference with ViroGates in connection with the company's recently announced rights issue. The company is today represented by CEO Jakob Knudsen and CFO Mark Da Silva. My name is Jens Jakob Obel Nordqvist and I work at Västra Hamnen Corporate Finance, and I will be the moderator for this web conference today. We will start with a presentation from the company, after which all listeners will have the opportunity to ask questions using either the question panel on the right side of your screen or in the bottom of your screen, depending on the unit you are using. After you've written your questions, I will read them out aloud and the company will then proceed to answer them. Before I hand over to Jakob and Mark, I'd just like to say that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be found on ViroGates homepage as well as on Västra Hamnen Corporate Finance YouTube channel. So with that said, I give the word over to you, Jakob and Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Jens Jakob. We are excited to be able to present our recently announced rights issue. And as always, we will just make a short introduction to our business because it's obviously the basis for any investments made. So the way we've structured this is that I will take you through our business as it looks currently today, and then Mark will go into more detail about the rights issues, how to subscribe, and the commercial terms, and a little bit about our financing and the use of proceeds. So first of all, a forward-looking statement, and this time it's a little bit more elaborated in the sense that any discrepancies that may arise from this presentation and the presentation that or the announcement that has been publicly made, the publicly made announcements prevail. So ViroGates is a company which was founded back in 2001. We are today 14 employees. We've been that for a period of time. So we are still operating semi-virtual in the sense that all of our manufacturing has been outsourced. We deal mainly with patents, with commercial issues, sales and marketing and so on from our headquarters in Birkerød in Denmark. We were listed at the Nasdaq First North Growth Market here in Copenhagen in 2018, and we work with a biomarker, and we use this to improve patient outcomes by, as we say, supercharging triage, and we'll get a little bit back to what that means. So the problem that we are addressing is the fact that healthcare systems are increasingly overburdened, and especially in the emergency departments. This is a well-known fact, and it's described in many reports. The trends is obviously, as you can see on the left-hand side, the aging population, chronic diseases, and so on. And most recently, obviously, also the COVID-19 pandemic, which works a little bit on both sides of the double-edged sword in our perspective, in the sense that it does provide us with some opportunities short term, but it has also postponed some of our traditional sales calls into the emergency departments in respect to our general triage. And again, we'll get a little bit back to that. We know that there's also a lot of data supporting this problem and quantifying the problem, but let's not dwell too much into that. suPAR is a naturally occurring protein. We all have it to a larger or lesser degree in our bloodstream all the time. But what is specific to suPAR is that it reflects the immune system's activation level. It's an inflammatory biomarker in general. It's generally predictive of patient outcomes, and the reason it is so is that it's an inflammatory biomarker reflecting chronic inflammation, but also picking up on the acute status of the immune system. So as I generally like to put it, it's the sum of all evils. It is basically the basis for which the patient is admitted, and the ability for the patient to cope with any short-term ailments. suPAR and how it's used in the traditional setting in the emergency department. And this was what we set out to do in 2018, and the reason for our IPO, that we generally had a value proposition to the emergency department patients referred by GPs, arriving by ambulances, or presenting by themselves went into the emergency department, and we could triage them by ways of our suPARnostic products, either as a support for discharge, getting rid of some of the patients very early on with a high degree of certainty. We had some data coming out, and we have to date even more data that have come out substantiating this claim. But we also pointed to the patients that where we needed a support of hospitalization, the patients with the high suPARs that needs to be admitted and needs further attention. This is illustrated on this slide, which may be a little bit complicated, but on the top bar you see the triage by ways of traditional systems. It's the triage scoring systems, typically involving fever, consciousness, and so on and so forth, blood pressures on the patients. If we put suPAR on top of that and re-triage the patients up and down, depending on their suPAR levels, we actually see a much higher degree of green patients, and this is obviously supporting the flow in the emergency departments, quicker exit of the patients that do not need a specific admission. And we also see a higher degree of the red patients, the ones that need admission, but this is obviously also in the interest of the hospital system. They don't want readmissions. They don't want patients to get worse when they get discharged. So basically improving triage overall. What happened obviously post our IPO was that the corona pandemic hit us, and suPAR, as said, is an excellent inflammatory biomarker. COVID-19 is an inflammatory disease giving rise to often a so-called cytokine storm. So we quickly hypothesized that we would be able to contribute to the treatment of COVID-19 patients. But obviously, being part of the life science area, we need solid proof of that. And we set up a large randomized controlled trial during the pandemic by ways of 37 different sites in Greece and in Italy, led by a Greek investigator, a clinical investigator, who used suPARnostic to triage patients for either the standard of care treatment or anakinra on top of standard of care. And we had a hugely successful outcome, 64% improvement in the overall clinical scores of this treatment. Supporting, we saved a lot of lives. We got rid of patients that otherwise would have ended up in the ventilators and so on. So a hugely successful trial, which led to an indication for the anakinra drug from Sobi by late 2021, actually on 21st of December. And this was for a suPAR guided anakinra treatment. And the way this works is shown here. So when people enter with a positive corona test with respiratory problems in the COVID-19 departments, and they also require supplemental oxygen, if they have a suPAR lower than 6 nanogram per mil, then they would be given standard of care. But with a suPAR higher than 6 nanograms per mil, they would be offered this anakinra treatment to dampen the cytokine storm, and obviously the traditional standard of care as well. And this is in complete accordance with the label extension provided by the EMA. So this is something that actually drove a lot of the growth of our sales during Q1. And we're looking to see if this is also going to be driving sales later this year. The value propositions in general for the emergency departments is that we, as said, can improve the patient outcomes, reduce healthcare costs, and empower clinical staff. That actually goes across the COVID-19 department as well. And we've quantified some of those value propositions. What do they sort of result in within the emergency department and also with the COVID-19 departments? And obviously, as Mark will get back to with the reimbursement, some of these supporting data from the interventional study are some of the data that we will be using in support of our reimbursement admissions for reimbursement. The addressable markets, let's not come too much into that, but we've quantified both the value of the emergency department, i.e. the general triage, and also the COVID-19 opportunity in North America and Europe, huge markets worth in excess of €1 billion, and we've also done that for Europe and North America combined. Generally, as said, suPAR is a prognostic biomarker. It's not pointing to a specific disease, but it generally points to patients that have a poor prognosis, where we need to look further for the specific pathogenic states. It's non-specific, works across all evil, as I typically say, all the inflammatory stages. It's stable in the sense that we don't need kinetics. Some of the other biomarkers, like troponin, for instance, need to be measured on several occasions to see if it's rising or falling. This is actually an absolute value, which is hugely beneficial when looking at the flows. It's fast. We have products that allow for measuring in 10 to 20 minutes of time. The way we complement systems is we complement the general risk scoring systems. We also complement the typical more diagnostic products out there, like CRP and procalcitonin, even ProADM, which is more of an inflammatory biomarker or infections biomarker. So we generally aid to all of the systems. So if we look at ViroGates today, we have a business which comprises approximately 9% of recurring revenue. So we've turned this business, as Mark will show, from a one-off sales opportunity to recurring clinical sales. We generally offer our products at anywhere from 10 to 20 euros, depending on the sales channel per test. And we have gross margins that are high, depending on the products. We have a product range which, as we mentioned, comprises both the ELISA in the right-hand side, which was the research product. We have the Quick Triage, which was the next in line that we launched and used for one of the big trials here in Denmark. It's a lateral flow technology, traditional lateral flow technology, but requiring a traditional venous blood sample. And then we have the automated the clinical use turbidimetric assays, which fits nicely into the existing hospital systems from Roche, Siemens Diagnostics, Abbott, and the likes. So that's basically a plug and play. We used to refer it to as the ink for an inkjet printer. We basically plug directly into the systems that they have available in the central lab. And most recently, we've also announced our Point of Care Plus product, POC Plus, suPARnostic POC Plus, which is a finger prick point of care lateral flow technology. We are very excited about this. The reason why we've not sort of spoken too much about it in the rights issue here is that we will be using the proceeds elsewhere, but they will be paving the way for the product. So we are really excited about this product. We're currently in a status where it's approved, but we're doing additional verification over the summer and early autumn with some clinical partners to reproduce some of the findings from the clinical validation before we actually make a full commercial launch. So we are really excited to have this product in the portfolio today. The last slide I'm going to show is where we are commercially. We have shifted a little bit, but in general, we have direct sales in predominantly Spain, France, Benelux, and Denmark. Then we have indirect sales, as we used to label them, by ways of distributors in the rest of Europe. We also sell into the US. That as Mark will illustrate, but it's for research use only. So we're not approved by the FDA currently, and we will get a little bit back to that by ways of the use of proceeds as well.
Great. I'll jump in here and discuss the rights issue more in detail. So as you may all know, we announced the rights issue last week with gross proceeds up to 19 million Danish kroner, and that's to initiate two new growth initiatives that we've worked on for a while, but also to ensure sufficient runway in the existing business, since we are dependent on COVID-19 and the way that the pandemic evolves. You can find more information about it if you need more after the presentation today on our website, and also on Nordnet, that's made a dedicated page for the rights issue. So before this rights issue, we've shown strong commercial traction. That's in the last quarter, doubling the number of routine customers. That was a result of this EMA approval that was received in December last year, where we saw an increased interest and use in the suPARnostic products in clinical routine at hospitals. At the same time, we've seen this development on the product side, where we've gone from 2019 mostly being a research sales organization to today having more than 70% of our sales in the quick triage and TurbiLatex products, which are the ones used in hospitals. And this is a trend that we would like to follow going forward as well, because that's sort of a testament to whether we're able to shift into this more clinical sales that's recurring compared to research sales that are more sporadic. Yesterday, we announced financial guidance. We've guided previously on when we would become cash flow positive, but it's the first time that we guide on revenue. And the reason for doing this is that we've matured the organization. We have more stable revenues now, so we can better forecast how things are going to develop. There's still quite a few uncertainties in these numbers. COVID-19 pandemic is one of them. It can both be a plus for us, since the more COVID-19 patients there are, the more suPAR tests are needed at the hospitals. But as we've also seen in 2020 and 2021, if there are severe pandemics, the hospitals often go into sort of an emergency state, and then it's really hard to implement new technology in the emergency departments. So it could also be a negative outcome, and the net effect is hard to predict. But these are the levels of revenue that we believe in, that we stand behind. So for 2022, 10 to 13 Danish kroner million, and up to 21 million in 2023. And then regardless sort of the outcome of the debt financing and rights issue, we are confident that we can become cash flow positive during 2024. We will also start guiding on EBIT, and we expect to announce that in August 2022 in connection with the creation of the H1 report, but also when we know the outcome of the rights issue and potential debt financing, as that will give us an opportunity to adjust investment levels to reflect the outcome of these types of financing. So what is it that we expect to use the proceeds for? It's three things, and the first one is reimbursement in Europe. So there are markets in Europe where reimbursement can be beneficial to have to ease the sales in these markets. In the investment brochure on our website, but also listed here, you can see some of the markets where it can be beneficial. Now, it's important to say that we say up to 8 markets. It doesn't mean that we necessarily go for all 8 markets on day one. And depending on the net proceeds we get from the rights issue and potential debt financing, we will adjust accordingly. But the markets are Belgium, it's France, it's Switzerland, it's Germany, it's Italy, Norway, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And the reason why these markets are interesting, I'll get back to in a moment, but we've done quite careful analysis of all of them with local market access experts. We expect that we'll use 20 to 40% of the proceeds on this initiative. At the same time, we will initiate an expansion to the US. Now, it's important to say this is not a full US rollout or scale up or establishing sales organizations or anything like that. this is taking the first steps towards a US entry. And the first step there, and most immediate step, is to apply for the emergency use authorizations that are still possible for COVID-19. And we would do this to guide the anakinra treatment from the study that Jakob presented earlier. We have very good data there, and that would be a first step. And then, based on the laboratory work that will be needed to do that, and the regulatory work that will be needed to do that, we would look at potential intended purposes or the ways of using suPARnostic in the US, and we would submit, develop and submit a first 510(k) application to do that. Now, whether that's going to be a broad ED application that often requires quite a lot of work, or whether it's going to be a more specific, smaller indication, that's to be decided. Also, depending on the proceeds that are raised in the rights issue and debt financing. And then lastly, we want to ensure sufficient runway, simply because we've learned that we cannot predict COVID-19. And if we are to scale on some of these initiatives, there may also be some administrative scale up. But I want to say the administrative part of that is minor, and if at all, depending on how the initiatives develop and the sales develop as well. So the target is somewhere between 18.5 to 31.5 million Danish kroner, and that's split into the rights issue that's up to 19 million, and it's in debt financing that we are in ongoing discussions with. We have nothing signed yet here, but we're in ongoing discussions of debt financing in the levels of 9 to 12.5 million Danish kroner. So a few more words about the reimbursement side of things, and then we will soon open up for some questions on this. But we've worked with local market access consultants in nearly all European markets now, and we've divided them into 4 different categories of markets. There's only 2 markets in Europe where it's nearly impossible to sell without a reimbursement code, and that's Belgium and Switzerland. Now, there's a theoretical possibility, but it's very hard for sales representatives to bet on those 2 markets. And those are the only markets where reimbursement is strictly important to have. And it's 2 of the markets that we wanna target. Then there are other markets. If you look at the other end of the screen with the ones where there's no reimbursement potential, they have systems that are set up in a way that it's simply not possible to get a reimbursement code, and a suPAR test would be funded in other ways depending on which markets you look at. And then there's the markets in the middle. That's the low and moderate reimbursement potential markets. Those are markets where we do sell today, most of them. It's markets where we also can sell without reimbursement, but where reimbursement could help some of our sales representatives or distributors engage in sort of increasing adoption and getting into hospitals faster. Because it is a better story if you come out as a sales representative and say that you can get reimbursement for the test, rather than the hospital having to find funding for the test elsewhere. So 2 markets is strictly needed, and other markets it would help some of our distributors or sales representatives in gaining access. And then, depending on sort of both attractiveness of the market, but also duration of how long does it take to get a reimbursement code, we've prioritized markets that ended up with these 8 markets that we will initiate in. And it's important to say up to 8 markets here. So the structure of the capital injection, I believe I've mentioned that. That's going to be partly equity and hopefully partly debt as well. So we are in ongoing, quite advanced dialogues on the debt side. On the equity side, the maximum offering is 19 million Danish kroner. We've already guaranteed 9.5 of those. Lastly, the details of the offering is that we are at 60 kroner per share. That's the subscription price. 1 existing share gives 1 subscription right, but you need 10 subscription rights to obtain 1 new share. The timeline of the offering is that trading in the subscription rights started 2 days ago. The subscription period for the shares starts today. The trading in subscription rights start on the 4th of July, and the subscription period ends on the 6th of July. On the 8th of July, we'll announce the outcome, and then on the 15th of July will be the first day of trading for the offering shares. And the way you can participate in this rights issue is through Nordnet or through your own bank where you hold stocks today. And it's possible both for existing shareholders that of course have preferential rights for this, but it's also possible for new shareholders to participate in case all trading rights are not being used. Those were the words from the presentation. Now we'd be happy to hear any questions there might be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark and Jakob, for that. I'd like to remind everybody who's listening that you have the opportunity to ask questions directly to the company using either the question panel on the right side of your screen or on the bottom of your screen, depending on the unit you're using. So while you guys write your questions, I thought I'd kick off this Q&A with a question of my own about the reimbursements. How important is obtaining reimbursement in Europe for you and for ViroGates as a whole?
Yeah. It's not strictly necessary in nearly all markets we operate in. And in our biggest markets today, we don't have reimbursement, but we still manage to sell. It will ease sales in some markets. And then there's Belgium and Switzerland, where it's, I'd say, very needed in order to gain a realistic foothold in the market. But it's not strictly necessary in all of the markets, but it's a process that we've been looking at for quite a while and that we've sort of worked quite closely with local market access consultants to figure out exactly for in vitro diagnostics products in an emergency setting, how does the reimbursement work in the different markets.
Yeah, and will the reimbursements be used specifically, or will they be used more broadly speaking, if you know?
It's a good question, and it works a bit different from market to market. But I can say generally in the markets that we are looking at, so those 8 markets, the way that reimbursement is structured is that once you get a reimbursement code, it's not necessarily tied to a specific disease. It's not like you get a reimbursement code for suPAR in COVID-19. You get a reimbursement code for suPAR using a turbidimetric assay. That's the typical way you would use it, and then it's at sort of the physician's discretion to use it the way they see fit. And then you get a certain tariff on the test as well, and that also varies from market to market. But we've chosen markets where tariffs are usually at, for comparable biomarkers, at an acceptable level for us as well. So that's one of the criteria those markets have been chosen on.
Okay. And do you have any guess on how long the timeline is for obtaining reimbursements and that process? Do you have an idea of that?
Yes. So for all markets, we have a quite clear laid out process, and we will have to work with local market access consultants in those as well. So for all markets, you need to develop a dossier and you need to submit it. And the way you submit it varies a bit from market to market, whether you just do directly or through intermediaries. But usually the process, I'll say on average, takes 2 years from sort of first application until you have a reimbursement code that can be used. In some of the markets we prioritized, it can take a year. And in a market such as France, which is probably the place where it takes the longest, depending on which route you choose, but if you choose the standard route, then that can take up to 3 years. But at least for the few of the markets we're looking at, we're looking into 1 year. But I would say on an average for those 8, it's around 2 years would be safe to assume.
Okay. And let's see. Yeah, we have a question here from the audience. What timeline do you expect for FDA approval? Moving over to the USA, of course.
Yeah, the US is a different animal, so to speak, because there are various pathways into the US, and one of them that you might have heard of from other companies is this sort of clear entry, which is basically not a fully FDA approved way in. This is not what we are seeking. We work, as mentioned by Mark, by ways of 2 different routes, and one is the emergency use authorization. This is a system that is in place in general, but it's specifically in place now for COVID-19 related applications. So it's something which it's not a permanent authorizations market. It can and probably will be revoked once the pandemic might be completely gone away, if at all. But it's generally a faster process and more lenient way into the US for an authorization, which is tied to something which is COVID-19 related. And the way that we envisage this pathway is by way of tying the use of suPARnostic into the anakinra treatment, supporting the clinical evidence that we have from the study sites that I mentioned here in Europe, potentially supplementing with data from an international consortium in the US in the treatment of COVID-19 patients with suPARnostic triaged patients for anakinra. And we know already from the FDA that the FDA will require an additional amount of work that we do on the what is known as the analytical validation. This means that we need to do more lab work in order for our products to be approved this way. So this is sort of the shorter way into the US. It will likely require at least half a year and probably close to a year before we get through that potential loophole. Then there's the other pathway which we mentioned, and this is the 510K. This is the traditional path of getting a permanent market authorization in the US by using a comparable product. So you basically do clinical testing and use a predicate product in the US. And we have identified certain predicate products that we could tie our product into, and there's actually also a slightly modified way known as de novo, but let's not dwell too much into that. The first path of the way into the US, also for 510K, is this analytical validation work that we need to substantiate our products with. So actually, the work that we are going to be doing, both for the 510K application and for the EUA, is similar with respect to the analytical validation. What differs will be the clinical package, and Mark mentioned this. It's basically tied to the intended use in the US. How broad do we actually aim for this? And this is also why it's difficult for us to say, to point to an exact number of patients, i.e. cost for this route. What we can say is that we can make a pre-submission once we've done the clinical validation with the FDA and get a consultative hearing, submit all the growing evidence that we have supporting our discharge and admission that I referred to from both Europe and selected US sites, and see what the FDA will require of supplementary data from a US setting. This is typically the way both for diagnostics and also actually for therapeutic products, to have a consultative hearing with the FDA. And they tend to be quite supportive in providing guidance to what we expect to see. And we have to do this with the FDA. So we can't sort of say we need 1,000 patients confirmatory in the US. We will have to negotiate, talk to the US FDA about the level of supporting data. So this is probably as far as we get, maybe to that submission, if we are fortunate with the pre-submission hearing for 510K. And then, as Mark also mentioned, we don't have the ambition at this stage to hire a sales force or anything like that. We will likely license this once we get further into the process. And there will be a number of bigger players that will be interested in an opportunity which is licensable for rollout in the US.
Okay. Sounds great. See, we have another question here from the audience. Are you planning on any change in your staff in connection with the new plans, and what kind of changes in that case?
Yeah. Also, we're not planning the biggest changes in the current staff. We believe we have the team that is necessary. Of course, if we grow significantly, we will need to make some changes. But mostly on the same sales channel, we use distributors, relationships that we've developed over quite a few years, and we've sort of worked a lot with the distributors, and they're of course not internally staffed, and they have quite a large extended sales force. So that's certainly one side. And then for the regulatory side, we have onboarded a new regulatory person in ViroGates, and we also have that part of that outsourced to the manufacturers. And lastly, I would say on the reimbursement side, we're mostly going to use external consultants, since many of these dossiers that are going to be developed are one-offs that has to be executed and sent in. So we don't plan on sort of growing the organization significantly.
Okay, good to know. I have a follow-up question on that from the audience as well. The new plans I see as very positive because you can speed up things and reach your goals much sooner. Is that correctly understood?
It's I would say yes, that's correctly understood. When you look at Europe as one of the sort of places where we've had our strategic focus, and reimbursement here would significantly speed up the adoption in Europe and in the core markets that we're focusing on. So we do see adoption, we do see increased commercial traction in these markets, but reimbursement we strongly believe would help that and increase adoption. So yes to that. And then when you look at the US, that's of course, when you look at market sizes, it's the most interesting market globally to look at. So that will be a natural next step once you've started succeeding in Europe, and laying the foundation for that already now, we believe is crucial. So yes, that's a long answer.
Good answer. So yes, that was from the audience. I have one last question, and I was wondering whether you guys could tell us something about how fast you expect to spend the capital raise from this, both in equity and debt, and if you'll be able to execute on existing business with the funds raised, so to say.
It's a good question, and we're not going to spend all of the cash on day one. We're not going to file. Let's take the reimbursement example. That's the first one. We're not going to file 8 reimbursement dossiers from day one. We're going to choose a few selected markets where we believe we have the highest potential and it's the most feasible, and we're going to send in those applications. And also, when you develop those dossiers, those applications, you can reuse parts of it in new markets. So there would be no need to have 8 different consultants developing 8 different dossiers. So we'll sort of spread that out in time, but of course execute as we see fit and learn from the process as we go. And for the US, that's also work that will be carried out over time. So not necessarily just spent on day one. First is the laboratory part, and then you move more into the regulatory part of things. And then lastly, for existing business, we expect, and before this rights issue, we maintained that we could become cash flow positive with existing cash at hand. That's still what our budgets showed. But with the uncertainty from COVID-19, we wanted to secure the runway. So part of the proceeds will also be used to securing sufficient runway to succeed in the sort of existing areas and existing activities.
Perfect. I have no further questions, and it looks like the audience has gotten their questions answered as well. So I think we can round off for now. Mark and Jacob, thank you very much for the presentation and for the Q&A.
Thank you, Jens Jacob.
Thank you, Jens Jacob.